Hello, and welcome to our Bible study as we continue to look at the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. I'm Edwin Weber, your host, coming to you from Spokane, Washington, through the ministry of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. Last week, we took a look at the ministry of Elijah, a prophetic ministry that is contrasted against the reign of pagan king Ahab and queen Jezebel. Now, when Jezebel tries to kill Elijah, God appoints a successor and a partner to his ministry in the person of Elisha. Elisha and Elijah. Elijah being the mentor, Elisha being the successor. Another pair of names that's a little bit hard for us to keep track of. But their stories are really quite profound and amazing. Elisha's call story involves Elijah going out and he sees Elisha plowing in the field, and Elijah takes off his mantle and places them around the shoulders of Elisha. And this mantle is going to come back in another story shortly, so pay attention for the mantle. Now, Elijah's initial reaction to being called is to say, well, wait a second, let me go and check with my parents. But Elijah makes it clear that he's only looking for disciples who have total commitment. And the story actually reminds me a little bit of a story from Jesus' ministry when he called a man, and the man says to Jesus, well, let me go and bury my father first. And Jesus kind of has a similar comment about only seeking disciples that are 100% committed. It's just yet another way in which Jesus' ministry seems to echo the ministry of Elijah and Elisha. Now, as Elisha is appointed Elijah's successor, so we're going to see several things that sort of confirm this position in sacred storytelling, that Elisha is this new prophet. And it all starts with the story where Elijah is taken to heaven. The two men, they travel with each other. They go to Bethany and then they go to Jericho. They're joined by a band of prophets. Elijah keeps telling Elisha to stay put, stay here. God is calling me to heaven. But Elijah insists on staying with his mentor as long as possible. This band of prophets, they go with them out to the river Jordan. And the band of prophets, they stay there on the western banks of the river. And Elijah takes off his mantle and he strikes the waters of the Jordan, and they are parted for him, just like the Jordan parted for Joshua and the people generations before. They go across the river, they go out into the wilderness beyond the Jordan, and Elijah is taken to heaven, but he leaves his mantle behind. Elisha picks up the mantle, goes back to the river Jordan, and this time when he gets there, it is he who parts the waters. He takes that mantle and he strikes the river and the waters part. And in this painting, you can see in the background that band of prophets. They are the witnesses of Elisha's return with Elijah's mantle. And it is the first of many stories that show the way in which Elisha's ministry is following in Elijah's course. The story has some interesting connections with the ministry of Jesus and John the Baptist. Of course, remember that river Jordan is, of course, the same river where John was doing his ministry of baptism. And John is distinguished for his mantle of camel's hair, just like Elijah is. Jesus comes to the Jordan for his baptism, and afterwards he's driven by the Spirit out into the wilderness that is beyond the Jordan, just same place where Elisha and Elijah went, where Elijah gets taken into heaven. And then after John's arrest and execution, Jesus continued his ministry, the ministry of John, who preached about repentance and forgiveness. So there really are a lot of similarities before these three men and their ministry in the Bible. If you've ever heard the expression to take up the mantle, or some version of that, now you know where it comes from. It literally comes from the Bible, because Elisha does indeed, both literally and figuratively, he takes up the mantle of Elijah's ministry and continues his prophetic work right where his mentor leaves off. So immediately following this, there are a series of stories, stories about Elisha's great deeds. And we'll see there are actually a lot of similarities between the ministry of Elijah and Elisha. And we really feel like that is because this Elisha is doing the same kinds of ministry that Elijah was doing. And that's really sort of important. So one of these stories, for example, that really echoes a lot from Elijah's ministry is that there's a story about a widow and a jug of oil. And this jug of oil, this oil magically multiplies. It's a lot like the widow of Zarephath. She tells Elijah that her children have been taken by a creditor because her family owes a debt. They've been taken into slavery. She has nothing to pay for their freedom. So Elisha tells her to pour out from the jug the oil and divide it into containers. And as she does this, the oil just never seems to run out. She goes and sells the oil. She repays the debt, and her children are released from slavery. Really powerful story. There is another story about another woman. She's not a widow, but a wealthy woman from Shunem. She prepares a room for Elisha to live in, and he rewards her by declaring that she would bear a son, even though she was barren, and she does. Years later, her son is out in the field with her husband, his father, and he complains about having a headache. And he returns home and dies in his mother's arm. My modern sensibility, I think of like a brain aneurysm or something, tragic like that. The woman goes to Elijah and almost angrily kind of confronts him, and she says to him in her grief that she never asked for a son, and that it would have just been better to not have one at all than it would to have been given a child and to have him taken away for her in this way. And as a result, Elisha goes to her house, sees her son, and heals the boy, raises him from the dead. He does this the same way that Elisha rose the boy from the dead with the widow of Zarephath. Elisha lays on him and breathes into him. Again, the same kinds of actions with the widow of Zarephath, and really making it clear that Elisha is following in the same lines of ministry as Elijah. Elisha and Elijah, hard names to keep straight between it all. In yet another story, Elisha feeds 100 men with only 20 loaves of bread. And I mean, you don't even need me to tell you this, right? It is yet another story that is echoed in Jesus' own ministry when he feeds the multitude. And then comes one of the most well-known stories of Elisha's ministry, when Elisha heals Naaman the leper. Naaman was a commander in the army of Aram, which was, of course, a foreign nation. So this is not Israel. This is not Judah. This is not a Jewish person. Um, Aram is sort of associated with Syria today. It might have occupied modern day Lebanon and Jordan, perhaps. We're told that Naaman had leprosy, which, of course, is a chronic, debilitating infection of the skin. It was highly contagious, and because it was so visual and because the way it physically looked, it was associated with ritual uncleanliness. Now, while ultimately leprosy would prove fatal for many, it was often the consequences of isolation from being ostracized for having the illness that was perhaps far more severe in the long term. Naaman was able to advance in his career. He is a commander of this foreign army. And yet the reality of being a leper was surely not lost on his servants, one of whom says that surely Elijah, that prophet of power, surely Elisha could heal him. And it would seem that the tales of Elisha's deeds of power had even come to Aram. So Naaman goes to Israel, first to the king of Israel, and then to Elijah to ask to be healed. And it's kind of interesting when Naaman comes to Elisha. Elisha doesn't even come out of the house and just sort of tells him to go and wash in the river Jordan. There's that river Jordan again. And Naaman is actually, initially, he's kind of incensed, saying that surely this man of God would at least call upon the divine name of his deity to heal him. And it almost is about to just go away back to Aram without anything happening. But his servants implore him. They say to him that, if Elijah had asked him to do something difficult, he would have done it without thinking. But why then not just do the thing that's very easy and see what happens? So Naaman goes to the Jordan. He washes himself, and his leprosy is washed clean. And he goes on to declare the greatness of the Lord as a result. And, looking at this triptych, which was painted, I think, in the Middle Ages, you can see how much the imagery is one and the same with John and the Baptist and baptism here. Because looking at this, you can almost get the impression that this was just anybody's baptism in this painting. I also love this painting, which is so joyful and jubilant, and I can only imagine Naaman's joy and the joy of his servants and his troops at his leprosy being healed. This disease that otherwise was chronic, it was lifelong, it was debilitating, it was possibly fatal, it was disfiguring, there was a lot of social stigma around it. So I wanted to share the joy of Naaman there. I really like that depiction. Now, in Luke's Gospel, in chapter 4, Jesus actually goes and preaches in his hometown synagogue in Galilee. And he talks about the widow of Zarephath. And he talks about Naaman the Syrian, the leper. They were both examples of people to whom God showed mercy and grace during the reign of kings. Now, many of the people in the synagogue are actually incensed, and they end up, at the end of the story, they end up trying to throw Jesus off a cliff because of what he taught, and how it made them so angry. And part of their anger was because Jesus was highlighting what was obvious in these stories, that these are Gentiles to whom grace was given. And Jesus seems to emphasize this quite pointedly in his sermon. We talk a lot about Jesus breaking down barriers in ministry, about eating with lepers and widows and sinners and Gentiles. But it is important to remember that Elijah and Elisha were doing this ministry long before Jesus' own earthly ministry. I think that it's important to remember that Jesus' ministry falls in the same vein as this ministry of prophets. Now, last week I did say that we were going to be looking more at these two prophets rather than the political intrigue of the kings. But the kings are part of the context of these stories, and so we need to look a little bit at the some from the reign of kings. I didn't want to leave us hanging because we talked a lot about Ahab and Jezebel last week, but their end is kind of a bit anticlimactic. Ahab ends up getting involved in a lot of different political intrigue. There's a rebellion, there's war, all sorts of different things, and he ends up dying in battle. When Elisha was on Mount Horeb, you might remember, God asked him to anoint Elisha, the new prophet, but he also asked him to anoint Jehu, as the new king of Israel. And Jehu does become king eventually, is anointed by Elisha. Again, Elisha is the successor. So Elisha even completes part of Elijah's ministry in this regard. There's a whole bunch of different things, rebellion, war, various different people come to power, but ultimately the wicked rulers of Israel are defeated, and Jehu reigns as the new righteous king who does what is right in God's sight. Part of the storytelling that we do involves the death of Jezebel. Some of you may know parts of this story. Again, it's not very significant, but I just wanted to mention it. Jezebel, even after the death of her husband, is still alive, and we really get the impression of reading the Bible, she is sort of behind the scenes pulling the levers of power still. But she is really despised by her people at this point. And when Jehu comes to Samaria, he has his men kill her by having them throw her out of the window. It's a very strange and violent end for Jezebel. And if you read, I just want to mention this, it's odd, and we can talk about it more on Thursday evening, but the Bible really emphasizes that the dogs came and licked up her blood. This was part of another prophecy that was going around that involved Jezebel and Ahab. So, in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of an anticlimactic end for Jezebel and Ahab. A good king is installed in Israel, but only for so long. Again, remember that these would not be the last wicked rulers of Israel or Judah for that matter. And if you remember from last week, the vast majority of the kings, they do not live up to God's expectations, and they are not good kings. Now, one of these kings that I want to highlight today, just briefly, is King Ahaz of Judah. Ahaz, so this again is Judah, so this is the southern kingdom. This is Ahaz, not Ahab, and they're not related. A lot of confusion sometimes about the names. But we are told that Ahaz was one of the wicked kings, one who worshipped other gods. But Ahaz takes it to a completely new place, because we are told that Ahaz sacrificed his own children to an idol by burning them in fire. It really is bizarre to hear of a king sacrificing his own children, but I really think it's important to mention it, because from the perspective of the authors of the Bible, from the people who are writing Chronicles and Kings, this is part of what they're trying to convey to us, that worshiping other gods take us away from God's presence, and it really warps our way of thinking. We know that God doesn't expect or ask that of us, but how far could we get off the path? How far would we be off the path if we were involved in sacrificing our own children? And we do know this is not just a story that somebody made up to try to sort some sort of religious or political propaganda. We know that there were gods that people worshipped in those days in that part of the world that did ask their followers to sacrifice their children to them. So to see a king of Judah stray so far from the path of godliness, it's hard to read about. Not surprisingly, the Bible indicates he had a short reign and that God delivered him into his hands of his enemies who defeated him and killed him, as is sort of a common expression in the Bible when talking about the wicked kings. Now, we're glossing over a lot of history, and as I mentioned last week, a lot of it isn't very important or very influential to our faith, which is why we're glossing over it, but it's hard to realize we're jumping quite far ahead in time, but we're focusing on those stories that are important. Eventually, though, both the books of Kings and Chronicles tell us that Israel, the northern kingdom, fell into the hands of the Assyrians. The Assyrians were one of many empires who ruled the wider region. And over time, we would see a variety of different shifts in power of the region. The empires of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Macedonia, and later Rome would all be different empires that would have a major impact on God's people. In no small part because of the region of the world that God's people occupied. If you think about Africa and Asia and Europe, Israel is kind of in this place where if you want to reign over them all, you kind of have to get through them in that part of the world. So there was sort of a practical reality of why these empires were so interested in the region. But they were also conquered just because that's part of what empires do. Empires just conquer and take more and more territory. And the reign of Alexander the Great really shows that, his entire kingship was really built on constant conquest. And he spent vast majority of his reign, not even in his capital, but on campaigns out in the world. So Samaria, the capital of Israel, was under siege for 3 years by the Assyrians before it fell. It was destroyed, and its people were deported to Assyria. Now, a lot of our story of faith really focuses on the conquest of Judah and the destruction of the temple at the hands of the Babylonians. But it really is important to remember that Israel, the northern kingdom, was defeated first, but by a different empire. Now the Assyrians, just like the Babylonians would do later, they deported many of the people from Israel, scattering them throughout their empire. A lot of them went to go to Nineveh, that city where Jonah was eventually called to be a prophet. After they deported the Israelites, the Assyrians settled their own people in the land. And so those were ethnically different than the Jewish people who had lived there. Generations later, when an independent Israel would reemerge and God's people would resettle in their own land, Samaria was treated very differently by God's people because the Samaritans that were there, many of them had converted to faith, to the Jewish faith, but they practiced it differently. And those tensions between the Jews and the Samaritans, they were still felt in Jesus' day and formed a big part of his ministry. Now, next time will be our last session on the books of Kings and Chronicles. We will be looking at some of the latter kings, two specific ones who were actually good and are worth mentioning and exploring a little bit better. We're going to look at Kings Hezekiah and King Josiah, both who were kings of Judah and who makes key reforms in the kingdom and in the faith. Ultimately, though, judgment is going to be visited on the house of Judah just as it was on the house of Israel, and the sons of David will no longer reign. Conquest will come and exile will happen. We will talk more about that next time, but until then, thanks for joining me and peace be with you.